The silence that dominated the Seoul Central Court had an almost physical weight, as if the environment itself were aware of the importance of that moment and decided to imprison any sound, holding everyone hostage to a suffocating expectation. Cameras lined up in every corner, searching for an angle that would capture the end of an empire. Reporters tried, in quick whispers, to transform rumors into headlines, while lawyers adjusted documents with tense movements, hoping that the apparent control of their hands would also manage to organize the emotional chaos that was settling in the room. At the center of this hurricane of speculation was Kang Ji-hoon, the man who for years believed he held the world in his hands. CEO of the Hanul Group, responsible for decisions that brought down competitors, manipulated markets, and transformed his name into a synonym for irrefutable authority, Ji-hoon always walked with the confidence of someone who knows every outcome before the game even begins. However, there, sitting before the judge who would define the future of his freedom and his reputation, something invisible gnawed at him from within, as if a silent crack opened in his chest and exposed the vulnerability he swore he would never feel. When the clock before him struck 9, an unexpected movement made everyone hold their breath. The front door opened slowly, with a creak that seemed to draw everyone's attention to that instant, and the rhythmic sound of heels echoed across the marble floor with such firmness that it seemed to defy gravity, as if each step were a declaration of power. The woman crossed the corridor, ignoring cameras, whispers, and judgmental glances, her tailored suit molding her unbeatable posture, and her impeccable bun conveyed a discipline that intimidated even the most experienced. It was only when the badge in his pocket reflected the light that the shock spread like electricity through the courtroom. Attorney for the public prosecutors. Office. Ji-hoon felt his stomach drop when the woman looked up. There was no doubt, hesitation, or surprise, only the inescapable realization that his past was before him, transformed into sharp justice. It was Seo Hana, the wife he had ordered imprisoned. And as she opened the folder, with the same elegance as one opens a sentence, a heartbreaking question formed in his mind. How did the woman he tried to destroy become the only one capable of destroying him? If this story already moved you in, the very first scene, imagine what's about to happen when the masks start to fall. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like right now so you don't miss any chapter of this surprising twist. With each episode, the truth gets closer, and you'll want to be here when everything explodes. Before there were courts, accusations, and cameras poised to record every fall, there was only a seemingly ordinary story, a story of two worlds that should never have crossed paths. It all began 3 years earlier, on a spring night in Busan, when the wind carried the salty scent of the sea and the lights of the Gwangan Bridge reflected on the water like tiny fragments of hope. That night, Seo Hanashe worked as a server in a small coffee shop a few meters from the beach. The routine was simple, taking orders, serving tables, and finding time between customers to study law in books worn from constant use. There was weariness in her eyes, but also a gleam of perseverance. She believed that with effort, she could build a better future. That's when Kang Ji-hoon entered through the glass door, not by chance but out of necessity. He had just come from an exhausting meeting with international investors and was looking for a quiet place to reorganize his strategies. As soon as he entered, the atmosphere seemed to bow to his presence. There was something impossible to ignore in his firm bearing, the impeccable cut of his suit and his focused gaze, as if he already knew how to dominate any situation. Hana saw dozens of clients every day, but never someone who carried such a cold and yet so magnetic aura. He ordered a coffee, but while he waited, he observed Hana with silent interest. There was something in the way she served him, something in the delicacy of her gestures that contrasted with the cold world of meeting rooms he was used to. She, in turn, perceived in him not power or wealth, but a strange loneliness hidden behind curt answers and an overly controlled demeanor. In the following days, Ji-hoon returned to the coffee shop more often than a CEO should. Hana, without realizing it, began to wait for the sound of the door opening. When he finally asked her name, it wasn't with arrogance, but with a curiosity that deviated from the norm in her life. The romance began quietly, built on long conversations after work, where Hana spoke of dreams and Ji-hoon spoke, for the first time, of his pain. She believed she had found someone she would learn to love over time. He believed he had found someone who didn't need to be conquered with power. Shortly after, he proposed to her. Hana accepted without hesitation, believing that love had the power to break down any social distance. Ji-hoon offered her a life of luxury in alone, with an apartment in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods, and clothes she never imagined she could wear. Everything seemed like a fairy tale, until she discovered that, in that universe, luxury came with invisible rules. First, Hana had to leave the coffee shop. Then her studies became unnecessary, according to him. Friends disappeared, phone calls dwindled until silence turned to nothing, and when she finally realized it, she was living in a mansion where everyone called her Mrs. Kang, but nobody looked at her as a person. The fairy tale had golden doors on the outside, but internal locks on the inside. And while Hana believed that love was enough to break down walls, Ji-hoon was only beginning to raise the bigger one. Between the two of them, initially, Hana believed Ji-hoon's silence was simply a result of the stress of a job that consumed his energy, and that with time, he would become more approachable, more human, perhaps even more affectionate. However, as the days turned into months, she realized that the silence wasn't tiredness. It was distance. Ji-hoon began to treat her as if she were part of a predictable routine, as someone who should always be available but never truly listened to. He left early for the office and returned late at night, not caring if she awaited him with a set desk or with her heart full of the day's news, wishing only to share small joys. When she spoke, he would simply raise his hand, signaling for her to be quiet, as if interrupting an inconvenient notification. The mansion was large, but the loneliness was even larger. Hana still tried to keep the connection between them alive. She carefully prepared breakfast, wrote affectionate notes, bought small gifts, hoping to elicit a smile. Nothing worked. Ji-hoon became adept at short, dry, almost administrative responses. "Leave it on the table. I don't have time. We'll deal with this later." Love, which should have brought them closer, began to become a non-existent term in that house. His indifference wasn't blatant, it was silent, and that silence hurt more than any shouting. When there were corporate events, Hana believed she would be introduced as his wife. However, she was relegated to the background. Like a decorative piece that couldn't interfere with negotiations, Ji-hoon avoided physical contact in public and dismissed any gesture of affection. To the business world, he already had a calculated and perfect image, and Hana seemed to be just a shadow that didn't fit into that impeccably planned scenario. One night, during a dinner where Hana tried to bring up resuming her studies, Ji-hoon interrupted her with the coldness of someone terminating a contract without remorse. "There's no need for that. Your role now is to support me. Studying is no longer part of this life," he said, adjusting his tie as if he were speaking to an employee and not the woman he had sworn to protect. Hana felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That sentence didn't just take away a dream, it took away her identity. What hurt wasn't the wealth or luxury that felt like a prison, but the way he treated her, as if she were replaceable. The distance between them had grown so much that even sitting at the same table, it was possible to feel that they lived in different worlds. Hana wondered at what point she stopped being someone he loved and became someone he tolerated. Until, without realizing it, she began to disappear within herself. Ji-hoon no longer saw the woman before him, only the projection of something he wanted to control. Hana still struggled to believe in their love, but Ji-hoon had already made another decision, one that would change their destiny forever. Because when control turns to contempt, the next step is destruction. The morning that would change everything began like so many others at Hanul Group. Phones ringing incessantly, secretaries rushing around with folders, and meetings scheduled with foreign investors. The atmosphere, however, had a different kind of tension. Whispers echoed through the corridors like an electrical wire about to short-circuit. Rumors about an internal audit had surfaced in recent weeks, pointing to a significant financial irregularity, and no one knew for sure who was responsible. One name appeared in the preliminary reports as being responsible for the movement of funds in a suspicious account, Sao Hana. The legal department handled the case with surgical coldness, sending Ji-hoon a folder with copies of documents showing bank transactions linked to his wife's name. To someone accustomed to dominating the narrative and controlling decisions, this seemed like definitive proof that Hana had deceived not only the man but the CEO, the strategist, the leader. His ego felt the blow before his heart. Instead of seeking explanations, he was filled with a proud and cruel certainty. She betrayed me. Hana had no idea what was about to happen. That day, she was finishing the arrangements for a special dinner, something simple but planned with care, trying to rekindle what remained between them. She had worn a light dress and prepared Ji-hoon's favorite dishes. She believed that with patience, she could break through the emotional wall he had erected. Hana was placing flowers on the table when the mansion door opened abruptly. Ji-hoon entered, accompanied by men in suits and 2 police officers. She smiled, believing that he had finally arrived early. But his smile was gone. Ji-hoon's gaze was impersonal, hard, almost hostile. He didn't walk towards her. He walked like someone advancing towards an enemy. "Kang Ji-hoon?" she murmured, confused. He threw the folder of documents onto the set table. The sound of the impact echoed through the silent room. Hana stared at the contents, flipping through the pages without understanding. Bank transfers, signatures she had never made, transactions in her name. Her eyes trembled, trying to find logic where there was none. "This isn't mine," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ji-hoon didn't hear. He didn't want to hear. "You embezzled money from my company. You used my name. You deceived me," he declared emotionlessly, as if he were issuing a purchase. "Order." The police officers advanced. Hana instinctively stepped back, her hands raised, asking for just a few minutes to explain. Ji-hoon remained motionless, observing her with the coldness of a judge who had already decided the sentence before the trial. "Please listen to me. I would never do that. I wouldn't even have access to those accounts. I don't have the power to sign anything," she pleaded, tears beginning to stream down her face. "It's over." His words came as a verdict. The police. Officers grabbed her arms and pulled her forcefully. When she looked back at Ji-hoon, she searched him for any trace of doubt, of love, of humanity. She found nothing. The man for whom she had abandoned her dreams now looked at her as if he were getting rid of a burden. The handcuffs tightened around her wrists. The sound of the metal echoed louder than any scream she could utter. Hana was dragged to the door, and as she crossed it, saw paparazzi and journalists pointing cameras. The flashes of light were like daggers piercing her dignity. She tried to protect herself, but her arms were bound behind her back. "What do you have to say about the robbery, Mrs. Kang?" they shouted. When Hana looked back one last time, she saw Ji-hoon standing in the mansion's entrance. He didn't run to her. He didn't try to defend her. He didn't try to understand. He simply said, with the coldness of someone signing an irreversible document, take her away. As the car disappeared into the streets of Seoul, Hana understood something she never would have imagined. There is no worse prison than being condemned by someone you love. But that wouldn't be the last time she was handcuffed. When the cell door closed behind Hana, the world seemed to shrink into a cold, damp concrete cubicle, as if the entire universe had been compressed into 4 narrow walls, incapable of containing the pain exploding inside her. The metal bench where she sat was icy, and the contact with the cold surface made her skin crawl, not from the temperature, but from the suffocating feeling of absolute abandonment. All her life, she had believed that injustice only affected distant, unknown people, and that love, however fragile, would always stand between her and any form of suffering. That morning, however, her world crumbled, and reality struck with devastating force, making it impossible to ignore that the man to whom she had given everything had been responsible for destroying her dignity with a single decision. The tears streaming down her face stemmed not only from fear or public humiliation, but from the feeling of losing something that could never be recovered: trust. Her heart burned as if someone had ripped away everything pure and replaced it with a cruel emptiness. As the hours slowly passed, Hana curled up, hugging her knees, trying to contain the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. With each breath, her mind repeated the same question like a tormenting echo. How could he? There was no possible logic that could justify what had happened, and that made it all the more devastating. With the dense silence filling the cell, Hana heard someone cough in the next wing, and suddenly realized she was completely alone, with no one to reach out to, no voice to defend her truth, not a single compassionate glance. She recalled the plans she had made, imagining a simple life with Ji-hoon, a life built on affection, small routines, and conversations about the future. As she cried, she felt each memory like a knife digging deeper into her chest, and this devastating sense of loss made her fingers tremble even as she tried to wipe away her tears. Time seemed to drag on mercilessly. At one point, an older woman, imprisoned in a nearby cell, observed Hana in silence. There was suffering in those wrinkles, and also a wisdom that only emerged in those who had already been broken by life. In a hoarse voice, she asked if Hana wanted to share what was hurting her so much. Hana hesitated, but ended up breaking down, recounting that she had been unjustly accused by her own husband, the man she believed she loved. The inmate listened to everything without interrupting, maintaining a firm and attentive gaze, as if she were facing a truth she recognized from afar. When Hana finished, the woman simply uttered a phrase that pierced her chest like a precise blow. "Daughter, when love becomes a weapon, the only way to survive is to transform pain into strength." Those words, simple and direct, echoed in Hana's mind all night. As despair gave way to a brutal understanding, she could not continue living in the shadow of someone who saw her as disposable. If it was true that Ji-hoon had the power to destroy her with a single command, then she would need to find within herself something even greater than love: determination. Hana didn't know how, when, or where, but she felt a silent intention being born in her chest, almost impossible to perceive, yet indestructible. At that moment, something changed. What had been a broken heart began to transform into a promise. She was still crying, yes, but within her, amidst the chaos, a silent whisper arose, saying that this pain would not be her end. The night wore on, and the first light of day streamed through the small window of the cell, illuminating her face, as if announcing that despite the destruction, there was a way to breathe again. Hana didn't know it, but that was the first step towards a turning point that would change not only her destiny, but Ji-hoon's as well. When the door opened and Hana heard she was free due to lack of evidence, she felt no relief. Freedom didn't erase the public humiliation, nor the memory of the handcuffs cutting into her wrists, while camera flashes recorded her pain for the whole country to see. She left the police station alone, wearing the same crumpled clothes from the night before, her eyes still red from crying. No one was there to meet her, not even a driver from the mansion. It was as if she had been discarded overnight, like something that had lost its usefulness. The silence around her was as heavy as that of the cell, and the only company she carried was the echo of Ji-hoon's words ordering her arrest. With nowhere to go, Hana took a bus to the bus station and bought the first available ticket for Busan, the city where it had all begun, but which now represented the place to try and survive what remained of it. During the journey, she looked out the window at the lights on the road and realized that until that moment, she had never stopped to think about who she was without Ji-hoon. She had become the shadow of a man, and now that the shadow had disappeared, she realized she didn't know where her own identity had been left. As Hana left, Ji-hoon's life continued at a frantic pace. Meetings, phone calls, packed schedules. He didn't even take a moment to ask where Hana was, if she had a place to sleep, or how she was dealing with the public shame. In his mind, the matter was closed. Hana was a mistake corrected, a threat removed from his life. He let her disappear without guilt, without regret, without even looking back. Days later, a journalist published an article insinuating that the arrest of the CEO's wife had been a hasty act without proper investigation. The comments started timidly, but soon spread across social media. Ji-hoon's image began to be questioned by shareholders and investors who saw the situation as a demonstration of impulsiveness and lack of emotional control. Even so, he ignored the signs, as if nothing could harm his empire. Meanwhile, in Busan, Hana rented a small room in a simple guest house near the port. The space was tiny, with peeling walls and a narrow bed. But for the first time in months, she felt like she owned her own space. She started working at a restaurant, cleaning tables during the day and studying at night, using the law books she had kept as a memento of who she was before becoming the wife of a CEO. However exhausted she was, a flame burned within her, a silent determination that grew with each page studied. Meanwhile, Ji-hoon was beginning to notice small cracks in the empire he believed to be indestructible. Urgent emails, tense meetings, restless shareholders. What he didn't know was that his biggest problem was yet to come, and it wasn't related to numbers or contracts. Fate was about to repay him for everything he had done, with interest. The following days in Busan were a constant struggle between what Hana had been and what she didn't yet know she could become. The alarm clock rang before sunrise, and she walked through the still cold streets to reach the restaurant where she worked as a cleaning assistant. It was a simple and arduous job, but unlike the life she led with Ji-hoon, no one there tried to silence her or diminish her worth. When her shift ended, Hana returned to her small room in the boarding house, and instead of lying down to rest, she opened her law books on the worn wooden table, illuminated only by the dim light of an old lamp that flickered with the unstable electricity. Those books had been rejected by Ji-hoon, but now they were the bridge to something she believed to be greater than any relationship, her freedom. The routine was relentless. In the first few weeks, her body protested against the accumulated fatigue, and many nights she fell asleep with her face buried in books. There were moments when the past invaded her mind with painful memories and questions that still consumed her. It was inevitable to think about the sound of the handcuffs, Ji-hoon's cold gaze, the way he discarded her without hesitation. However, every time despair threatened to swallow her motivation, Hana took a deep breath and repeated to herself that pain is also fuel. On a particularly difficult morning, she found a small, abandoned mirror on the boarding house table. The glass was cracked, but it reflected. Enough for her to see her own face and realize that sadness wasn't the only mark in her eyes. There was something new there, something that hadn't been present in the days she lived, surrounded by the suffocating luxury of the mansion. Determination. Inspired by this moment of silent lucidity, she wrote a phrase on the mirror with a black marker, a phrase she began to see every day upon waking and before going to sleep. Pain doesn't destroy me. It guides me. Over time, Hannah regained her rhythm. She began studying not just to finish college, but to excel. Each article of law she memorized was like rebuilding a piece of herself. When she finally registered for the Korean bar exam, no one knew her story. No one imagined where she had come from or what she had been through. In the eyes of the examiners, she was just another candidate among thousands. For her, it was more than a test. It was a chance to turn the page on the life that had been ripped away from her. Months later, when she received the envelope with the result, her hands trembled. Upon opening it and reading the word, approved, Hannah didn't cry. She simply breathed deeply, like someone finally emerging to the surface after remaining submerged for a long time. The pain hadn't disappeared, but now it had a purpose. While Hannah grew up in silence, without announcing her transformation to the world, the universe began to prepare its first blow against Ji-hoon. While Hannah quietly progressed through her transformation, far away in Seoul, Kang Ji-hoon's empire began to crumble, even though he refused to see the signs appearing before his eyes. The first crack appeared at a meeting with international investors, when one of them questioned the rumor that the CEO's own wife had been arrested for involvement in embezzlement. Ji-hoon tried to downplay the matter, treating it as a minor misunderstanding. But Hannah's name, associated with the scandal, became increasingly difficult to ignore. Shareholders began to distrust not only the situation, but also the impetuous way Ji-hoon had reacted to the problem. Someone who arrests his own wife without investigating is someone who can destroy anyone who opposes his interests. His image, once admired for its strategic coldness, was now seen as emotional instability disguised as authority. Within a few weeks, the value of Hanyul Group's stock plummeted. Memoranda circulated within the company, and employees whispered in the hallways about rash decisions, explosive tempers, and loss of control. Ji-hoon, however, tried to maintain his ruthless leadership posture, believing that everything could be resolved in the same way he had always solved problems, with money, power, and intimidation. However, for the first time, none of these weapons worked. It was as if the universe was beginning to return one by one the choices he had made without considering the consequences. The next blow came from where he least expected it. The CFO, the same one he had protected and promoted without allowing Hannah to question him, disappeared from the country, taking confidential documents and a significant portion of funds hidden in international accounts. The scandal exploded in the media like an inevitable bomb. Headlines appeared on major news portals with words he never imagined reading associated with his own name: fraud, corruption, investigation. The prosecution decided to open the case and summon the CEO to provide explanations. For the first time, Ji-hoon felt real fear, the kind of fear that doesn't fit into arrogance nor find refuge in the certainties of someone who always believed they were above the law. That night, he remained alone in his penthouse apartment, surrounded by luxury and silence. He tried calling influential people, tried demanding favors, tried manipulating the situation as he did with any corporate crisis. But he discovered painfully that no one seems loyal when the fall is near. Deep in that icy solitude, Kang Ji-hoon began to realize something he had never allowed himself to feel: the emptiness of lacking someone who loved him, not for his position, but for who he was as a person. and that person he had destroyed with his own hands. Fate, however, still had the most devastating blow in store, one he could never have imagined. On the day of the preliminary hearing at the Seoul Central Court, the atmosphere seemed charged with electricity. Journalists jostled for every inch of space, cameras were held high above their heads, and rapid-fire conversations rang out on the phone as if the entire city awaited the moment when the most powerful man in the corporate sector would be confronted by the law. Kang Ji-hoon arrived accompanied by renowned lawyers, confident that this hearing would be just another obstacle to be removed with influence and money. He believed that with his demeanor, he would intimidate the judge, the prosecution, and anyone who dared to question him. His arrogance was so pervasive it seemed like a perfume ingrained in his skin. When he sat down at the defense table, he crossed his hands and observed the movement in front of him. Murmurs grew louder when the lawyer's door opened, but what happened next was so unexpected that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. First came the footsteps, firm, rhythmic, making their presence felt. The sound echoed like a silent announcement that something extraordinary was about to happen. Ji-hoon looked at the prosecutions, podium with boredom, expecting to see yet another junior lawyer eager to show off their resume. However, when the woman entered, the courtroom lights seemed to shift, and for a moment Ji-hoon couldn't breathe. It was work, but not the Hana who once bowed to please him, who tried to extract affection from harsh silences, who begged to be heard. There was no trace of that woman. The one who now walked towards the judge carried in her posture a confidence that made the room bow before her. The dark suit marked her presence with severe elegance. Her tied-back hair left her gaze exposed and unerring, and each step carried the strength of someone who knows her own worth and will never again accept being diminished. When she passed in front of the defense bench, her eyes met Ji-hoon's. He froze. Hana didn't look away. She maintained a firm and indifferent expression, as if she were looking not at a man she once loved, but at a defendant who would now face justice. Without changing her tone of voice, she spoke to the judge. "The indictment is ready, Your Honor." The murmur that echoed through the room was almost deafening. The journalists stirred, the lawyers exchanged confused glances, and Ji-hoon had to take a deep breath to believe what he was seeing. He tried to say his name, hoping for some reaction, any sign of recollection. She continued organizing the documents as if his presence were irrelevant, and without looking at him replied, "In court, I don't refer to you by your name. Here, you are simply the defendant, Kang Ji-hoon." That sentence hit Ji-hoon like a preemptive pronouncement. For the first time, he realized he was facing a woman who no longer feared anything or anyone, least of all him. And Hana was only just beginning. The courtroom was filled with a dense atmosphere, as if the air had acquired an almost physical weight, making it difficult to breathe. In the first few minutes of the hearing, the prosecution presented superficial documents demonstrating that a large sum of money had been transferred to overseas accounts linked to Kang Ji-hoon's name. The defense tried to argue that it was all just persecution, but Hana remained silent, waiting for the exact moment to act. She hadn't come just to accuse. She had come to dismantle, piece by piece, the image Ji-hoon had built over the years. And she would do it with the same precision with which a surgeon removes a tumor without missing the cut. When the judge authorized the presentation of the main evidence, Hana walked to the screen with a firm posture and inserted a pen drive into the computer. The first image projected was a copy of the document Ji-hoon had used to incriminate his own wife months earlier. Silence filled the room, and everyone remembered the public humiliation of Hana being led away in handcuffs while reporters photographed her as if she were a criminal. Ji-hoon's defense tried to interrupt, but the judge ordered them to remain silent. Hana approached the screen and, circled with the laser, the area where the signature that supposedly belonged to her was located. It was then that she turned to the judge and said in a firm voice, without a trace of emotion, that that signature had never left her hands. Next, she projected the technical analysis done by an independent handwriting expert, proving that the signature had been forged by someone trying to imitate her handwriting, but who had made a crucial mistake. They had used a signature pattern from much earlier than the marriage, taken from an old contract Hana had signed before meeting Ji-hoon. The court began to murmur. Ji-hoon paled. Hana continued as if delivering the final blow with surgical precision. "But that's not all," he declared as he moved to the next slide. The screen displayed images from the company's internal security cameras, recorded on the finance floor of Hanul Group. In the recording, the CFO, Ji-hoon's mistress, typed his password to access the system and authorize the transfer of funds abroad. Hana zoomed in at the moment the system requested access confirmation. The user's name appeared prominently, along with the CEO's digital security token. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. There was no longer any doubt. He had participated. And worse, after his mistress disappeared with the money, Ji-hoon tried to make Hana the scapegoat. Suddenly, what was just an accusation became an undeniable fact. When the judge finished reading the sentence, the silence in the courtroom was so profound that it seemed as if even the air had stopped. The words, spoken firmly, echoed like hammer blows on the cold floor. Kang Ji-hoon, sentenced to 8 years in prison for financial fraud, document manipulation, and coercion. It was the first time Ji-hoon had found himself completely powerless, unable to control the course of events, unable to use his contacts, unable to buy his own way out. What he had always despised, the consequence, had finally caught up with him. As the police officers approached to handcuff him, he had a strange feeling of déjà vu. It was impossible not to remember the scene months before when he had ordered Hana to be handcuffed and led before the photographers as if she were a criminal. Now, he was the one in the place he used to coldly point out, and each click of the cameras recorded his downfall with the same cruel intensity with which they had previously recorded her suffering. Feeling the cold touch of the metal on his wrists, something inside Ji-hoon broke. His arrogant gaze turned to despair, and for the first time he searched for Hana with his eyes, as if pleading for help, as if believing that some trace of the love she once felt still existed. However, what he found was only firmness. Hana remained silent, with a serene expression, and that silence was more painful than any words. He tried to call her, but his voice didn't come out clearly. It sounded like a cry for help. The pain he felt wasn't related to imprisonment, loss of status, or scandal. It was the devastating awareness that he had destroyed the only person who had truly loved him selflessly, and that now it was too late to undo what he had done. As he was led out of the courthouse, he passed through the same corridor where Hana had been humiliated in front of the press. The difference was that, back then, Hana was crying, and he maintained an upright posture. Now, it was he who walked with his head down, trying to hide his face while the world watched the downfall of the man who believed himself invincible. As he got into the car that would take him to prison, Ji-hoon looked out the window and realized that it wasn't the empire he had lost. It was the chance to have been a better person. However, despite the sentence, one last truth still awaited revelation, a truth that would define the fate of both. Time passed and life went on, far from the noise of the courts, the sensationalist headlines, and the prying eyes. Seo Hana now. I walked through the quiet streets of a small coastal town, where the waves gently broke on the shore, and where the smell of the sea seemed to carry a silent invitation to breathe again. The routine was simple, but full of meaning. Waking up early, opening the notebook, analyzing new cases, and using my profession not as a weapon, but as a bridge to restore dignity to people who never had a voice. Advocacy ceased to be just a goal. It became a mission. With each case in which I defended someone wronged, a part of them was restored. There was no longer any urgency to prove anything to anyone, because true justice is not born from the desire for revenge, but from the awareness that one finally belongs to oneself. Meanwhile, on the other side of this story, Kang Ji-hoon, he was serving his sentence. From the top of the narrow cell, he observed a rectangle of sky framed by the bars, and in that limited space, he finally discovered what silence was. Not the arrogant silence he used to humiliate, but the silence that forces one to look inward and see what one has avoided all one's life. He recalled conversations he ignored, gestures of affection he scorned, and above all, the last look Hana gave him in court. Serene, firm, without hatred. Now he understood that his punishment was not prison, it was living, knowing that he had lost the only love that could not be bought. Loneliness slowly healed his arrogance, and for the first time, he understood that no power is worth anything when there is no one to share the journey with. In the early evening, facing the sea, Hana let the wind ruffle her hair and closed her eyes, feeling the peace she had so longed for. There was no victory, nor defeat. There was only a new path, and as the tide ebbed and flowed beneath her feet, a silent certainty formed in her heart. No one can imprison that which was born to be free. If you felt this story, sign up now and continue following the next profound and exciting narratives. You won't want to miss the next chapter.